Welcome. I expect that everyone's going to be completely asleep because we booked this right after the lunch break. I also intentionally gave it the most boring BS sort of a title that this session could possibly have. I wanted to sound like some stuffy HR manager stuck up in some office somewhere. So hopefully we weeded out the folks that aren't really actually interested, and we're going to have a good conversation today. My name's Kyle Simpson. A lot of people know me as Getify online. The stuff that I've done, feel free to Google search that. I'm not going to talk about myself much. I want to set up this topic because I was asked to moderate a panel, and I was like, okay, I'll moderate a panel, and then like, okay, what's the panel going to be about? So I was thinking, what is it that I want to talk about within the context of a technical conference? And all of the obvious, usual technical topics, which there have been amazing talks about so far, and even the rest of today, there's great talks. But all those usual boring stuff was like, everybody's already talked about that, and I've already talked about that 100 times. So let's not talk about the technical stuff. Let's talk about the other stuff that makes us be able to have an industry, the stuff where we're working in jobs. Whether you are a client that hires people, whether you are a person that sells yourself out as a consultant, whether you're somebody that works in a developer role in a full-time, and whether that job is a consultancy or an agency, a product company, or anywhere in between, small to giant, all of us have to, in some way, shape, or form, work at what we do. We have to get paid for what we do, or we have to pay others to do what we do. And that means that this process is pretty integral to us keeping our community and our ecosystem healthy. And I don't think that we talk enough about this. There's medium think pieces where people thought leader about stuff, but I don't think we have community conversations about it. So to that end, I do have a set of questions that we're going to be asking the panelists about this topic, but I want to encourage you through Twitter, if you will use the hashtag #TechInterview, so hashtag #TechInterview, I'm going to be watching that Twitter search, and if any questions pop up, I'll try to see if we can weave that in, because I'd like this to be a bigger conversation, but also don't let it end at the end of the session. Come up and share with us or share with each other the thoughts that we provoke from this. So my premise for this talk was, to put it bluntly, that tech interviews are totally broken from the top down. And that comes from my own personal experience as well as many others, and there's so many different angles to that, and I'm really not going to get into a lot of that, but I will just say this. I think the reason why it's broken is because we're approximating the signals that we want to know. I think a lot of us know what those signals ought to be, but we're approximating those things because it seems too hard to actually create a scalable process to select for the real important signals. And so I think we need to kind of break down that process and talk about how that process can be better so that we can be more effective, again, as a community. So that's the purpose of this discussion. My bias is that it sucks and we need to make it better, and I hope that the panelists will have much more intelligent ways of articulating that than I just did. Okay? So with that, let me introduce who's going to be speaking with us today. To my left, I have Stacy Mulcahy. She is a program manager of the Garage in Vancouver, and that's literally all she wrote for her bio, so we'll have to learn the rest from her discussion. Next to her, we have Scott Biggert, is a web developer at Uber, currently based out of New York, and focused on building out the logistics platform Uber Rush. To help the engineering org grow from 13 to 1,300, he has conducted hundreds of technical phone screens, on-site interviews, and hiring debriefs over the last 4.5 years. And on the end, we have Harris Mahmood, is a developer at Shopify and instructor at Ladies Learning Code and HackerU. He enjoys soccer, Game of Thrones, and Emma Watson, and I promise he actually wrote that. I didn't make that up. So that's cool. All right, so those are our panelists. And to kick things off, just so you know, I'm not a moderator that just sits back. I'm going to make sure that they actually give you real answers. So I'm going to expect all of you to give me an answer, and at least one of you needs to disagree with somebody else, or it's not good enough. So to start off with, let's talk about the screening process that happens. We're screening candidates because you open up a job position and you get 1,000 applicants. You can't possibly talk to them, so you have technical screens that happen. But why is this process so formulaic, panelists? Why is it just matching buzzwords and often so shallow? And really, does the screening process necessarily have to be that way? Who wants to start?
I'll go. So I think the screening process is sort of like certain aspects of it are good and necessary and needed, and other aspects are terrible. When you're just trying to match specific words, whether specific frameworks and names of tools show up in someone's resume, I think that's terrible. Because that doesn't go to show whether or not they understand the concepts. You're just looking for specific words to like quicken the process, and I think that's the wrong aspect. The better side of it, from what I've seen, is when like too often people will just like batch apply to like 100 jobs, even though they haven't read the deeper requirements for a specific job. Like, oh, this is a senior developer role. I have 6 months of experience. I'll just apply. Like, so processes like these are needed to like weed out the, just blindly applying and not paying attention to what's actually happening. All like the laziness that goes into like that batch applying needs to be weeded out at this point.
That's fantastic. Anyone else?
Yeah, I mean, so in a little bit, I sort of disagree with the premise, or at least that this happens everywhere. I mean, I think that if you are a small startup that are getting, you have the luxury of 3 applications a week, you are looking really deeply into that resume, and you're looking like you're trying to find a story, you're trying to click on every single GitHub link, you're really trying to dive in because you're not getting all of these applications. And so that's something to consider, like where in the cycle of the engineering organization exists. Also, have you outsourced, technical recruiting? Is that a third party, or is that in-house, or is that literally an engineering manager like going to forums and saying, hey, we've got job openings? So it really depends on the size of the organization to go with that. But sort of to his point, like once you become really large and you start getting huge numbers because you've got sort of, for whatever reason, people are now deciding this is a place you want to go, you have to have some mechanism. And I think it really depends on sort of, I mean, I don't know. When it comes to buzzwords, that's never going to be like the best way to do it. But if someone like literally doesn't have the word JavaScript on their, web developer application, that would probably be an interesting red flag. So, yeah.
I mean, we have to. I work at Microsoft. Like, we have so many people who apply all the time. Are those the people I want to interview? Yeah, no, right? Usually the people that I try to get into interview loop or I'm interviewing for, it's made some other way outside of that black hole submission process. But like you said, bigger companies where you're getting thousands and thousands and thousands of applications and you have thousands of jobs that are open, like how do you manage that without doing that? So are there better ways to improve that process outside of matching that? Absolutely. Recruiting events, in person before they even submit to the black hole. And we're starting to do that as a company, which I thought was pretty interesting. But, when you get to a certain size, sorry, dude, gotta,
Yeah, so I don't think that screening is like an evil that we have to get away from. But the premise of my question is, why does screening have to be this arms race where the job is listing out all these crazy keywords, maybe only half of which are they actually going to use on a daily basis? And then the people that are trying to be candidates are saying, well, I don't really know React, but I've read a blog post about it, so I'm going to go ahead and list that on there because I might be able to learn that React thing. And then there's also the angle, which is that if you are applying to a job that you are already 100% qualified for, you're applying to the wrong job. You're supposed to kind of grow into a job. So that's why I call it this arms race. So how do we dig deeper? I think you started to talk about this, Stacy, but let's get specific. How do we dig deeper behind just, did the resume have the word jQuery on it or not, to actually figure out if this person is a good person for us to have those deeper conversations with?
So one thing that I've experienced, so I was in San Francisco for 4 years before just moving to New York 6 months ago, and what resumes look like are very, very different. And so one of the things we've had to learn is that people that have a tremendous amount of great experience in New York is really different than San Francisco. And like literally like having none of those buzzwords. They're like a lot of people are, if you're working at a bank, you're working on really sophisticated systems, but that are maybe a little bit legacy from like a technology standpoint. So you really have to, you can't just use these buzzwords. You literally are like, you're getting these resumes and, you're seeing like, maybe this is like another version of a buzzword, but it's like, how many years of experience do you have? And then matching that up with like, what are the kinds of projects that you've led, or what are the things that you've done. And I mean, really, it's more about like, does this person have something really interesting to say about the work that they've done, as opposed to saying, this is the tech stack that I have. I mean, we're much more interested in what are the kinds of interesting problems you've solved, regardless of the technology, because quite frankly, and we've been talking about this, the last 2 days, technology is moving so fast that it's like, if you're really good at something right now, and that's the only thing you're going to be good at in 2 years, well, chances are you're not even going to be using it anymore. So I think you really have to like look into a resume and feel like, what is the story of this person? Like, did they start off by, building features, and then they started like owning projects to the point where now they're owning entire systems? Like, is there a progression between like where they started out a couple years ago to where they are now? And can they say that with, I say confidence, but like, can they sort of articulate, this is the responsibility I have based on the work experience that I've been given?
Yeah, one thing that I look for as well is whether or not they're mentioning any of the impact that they've had based on the work that they're doing. Like, cool, yes, you're a React developer, that's fantastic, or you're a JS developer, that's fantastic, but what kind of impact are you bringing to your team, to your company? Are you improving processes? Are you putting more things into place that helps improve the efficiency of the company itself, the team itself, the product itself? Like, what are the outcomes of the work that you're doing? And I like to see if anyone's talking about those in those resumes.
But can a technical screener, or a non-technical screener, which they often are, just sort of barely understanding the terminology anyway, can they effectively measure that? And if they can, how?
It's definitely difficult, and the one of the biggest issues that I've seen is that a lot of the people doing the hiring don't know enough about what they're hiring for, and that's one of the biggest reasons why buzzwords are thrown into job descriptions in the first place, because they don't know how to gauge whether or not someone is going to be capable of doing what they need them to do. So they just ask the tech team, like, hey, so what kind of stuff do you work on? These 7 things, cool. And just like put together a quick, job application or a job requirement. So there isn't enough knowledge base in the team that's actually doing the hiring and putting out those job applications themselves. Like, they need to improve their process first as well.
That's true. Okay. I'm hearing a lot of, and that's not surprising because we ask panelists that have experience with hiring, but I'm hearing a lot of the perspective of, well, we just have to because we get so many resumes. That's sort of the top-down hiring. But I imagine that each one of you at some point went through a technical screen yourself for some job perhaps early in your career. So I want you to think back to that and ask yourself from the empathy perspective, did that process work well for you? Do you feel like you were properly identified for the positions, say, earlier in your career when you were going through those phone screens?
So you're saying maybe I'm mixing up, or when you say phone screen, you're saying like when I get on the phone with somebody, like I was understanding this as like a resume gets put on a stack,
Sure.
and you're using a screen to say whether or not you get the phone screen.
Looks
Right.
a whole bunch of different ways.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So there's the people that are just sifting through and somebody's just kind of picking out resumes. Some people are having a quick 5-minute call with you and asking about, tell me about jQuery, but they don't actually know what you're saying. They just want to know if you actually can talk about it. So the whole screening process in general, did it work well for you when you were younger in your career?
I think having a conversation, even if it's for a few minutes with someone on an actual technical team, is extremely important for both parties. Like you mentioned, needing to know X tool or X framework or whatever could mean anything. It could mean you barely touch on it, or it could mean you use something every single day. So to have that quick conversation immediately tells both sides of the party, how deep is the knowledge base, how deep is the need for this knowledge base, and whether or not that's a good fit or not. Based on just reading a resume, you won't get enough of that. You need to have at least a few minutes worth of conversation.
All right, so one thing that I think is interesting about this discussion of the screening is that there's an implicit motivation here, which is there's a high cost to hiring the wrong person or even just interviewing the wrong person. You are going to take some of your highest paid developers off of billable projects or off of important work for hours, perhaps even an entire day. There's a big barrier there, and we want to make sure that we're funneling the people in that are going to be likely to be successful in that process. So I'd like to ask each panelist to share, in your perspective, what do you think is the one most glaring thing that the technical interview process, we've already screened people and we get people in, but what's the one thing that they get bad right now, that they do poorly right now? And that ends up leading to hiring wrong candidates later because we're not figuring out if this person is actually the right person for the job.
I mean, going through this the last couple of years, I think one of the worst things I've seen is you're completely qualified, but you don't understand the job. And someone sold you the job as something else. And so then you come to me and I start to tell you the truth about the job and you're like, oh shit. And so you just wasted an hour of my time and I wasted an hour of yours. And all because people are doing their job of filling in that interview process. And so I think one of the top things I always recommend people do is, I don't care if you're talking to a recruiter, a technical person, whatever, like ask things like, what am I going to hate about this job? Right? Like tell me, because if you tell me it's all positive and roses and based on what I've told you, then they're not selling it right. And so I think for me, that's personally one of the things I sit in these interviews and it's over 5 minutes in, like I already know, because they're not gonna like the job and I can just deduce that and ask them the questions and it comes right there. Like they're just like, oh, I didn't realize that, or oh, so that for me is number one.
Yeah, for me, so I think a lot of it is where you get maybe on the side of like you pass on somebody that could potentially good, not as opposed to like saying yes to somebody that isn't, would be focusing a lot more on sort of theoretical versus practical. I see this a lot where it's like, for me, this is one of my biggest pet peeves is, asking questions that are specifically designed where there's like an algorithm that solves this, or this is the way in which you should approach the problem, and there's like the right answer. And it becomes very easy for you to, one, stump somebody because like they're just not quite thinking about it in the way that you are, and especially as an interviewer, it's like, I've done this 20 times. It's really obvious how you do this. And then you immediately are thinking, oh, this person is stumbling, and maybe you're not giving them hints. And so, and it also, I think, like disproportionately, like helps people that have like just graduated from like a computer science degree, right? Where it's like they've studied a bunch of this stuff, but they might not have any practical knowledge about how to build anything, but they really know when it's like the perfect time to use bubble sort, And so I think that's one thing that I've seen people focus on a lot. Now, if you're working in an environment where those are the things that are really important, obviously, you got to test them for that. But I think it's more important to know, do they know that there is the difference like based on this data set, maybe you should look at, basically the idea is that like you should know that there are different ways that you should sort in different kinds of data sets, and then you use the internet to help you figure out based on your problem, right? As opposed to being forced to figure it out in that short period of time. And so that's one thing I've seen people focus on, that I see candidates that I'm like, this person is amazing, and they happen to not know that something was n log n, and it's just like that's not a reason to not let them in. And then on the other side, I think one thing that we see that we don't do enough of to sort of weed out bad candidates is sort of force them into a situation of conflict. Basically ask them questions about, when did you have an issue with a previous coworker, or even in a sense, like say, like, I think you're wrong about this. Can you please like help justify your answer? Because you can really quickly get people to get flustered or get really sort of antagonistic and like don't want to have like a reasonable conversation, and you can immediately know like this is not someone that's going to work well in a team. And if you don't do that because it's something that's uncomfortable, sometimes you can let someone in, and then as soon as you have these in real life sort of conflicts, which conflict is good, all of a sudden you've realized, oh, whoa, this person is really not compatible with us from a cultural standpoint, and we've made a mistake.
Yeah, I think it's really important to see how a person thinks in terms of like how they approach beginning to solve a problem, like what their mindset is when they're trying to come up with a solution for something. And I personally don't care what tools they use to get there. I want to see how is this person thinking about the problem. How are they breaking it up? How are they trying to solve each of those components of that problem, trying to glue it all together, and not just think of it for like that short term, but like I want to see, hey, are they thinking about long-term benefits? Are they thinking about what's going to come after this stage, and sort of see do they understand the problem not just at a foundational level, but at a more holistic level? Do they understand how it's going to impact them in the future?
So in that scenario, who's making the mistake more? Is it more the interviewer not digging that out, or is it more the candidate not choosing to force and expose those details?
Yeah, totally. I think quite often an interviewer won't make it very clear what they're looking for, and if they're not making it very clear and are expecting and needing X, Y, and Z to be said for this person to move forward, then that's extremely unfair. You can ask leading questions without giving the answer right away, and you can see whether or not that person is thinking along those lines. I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, that's actually sort of reminds me, like, one of the things I always tell a candidate in the very beginning of an interview, especially if it's one that's a little bit more on the whiteboarding side of things, is I say, this question, nothing about this is supposed to be a trick, right? Like, I'm literally, if you do not understand what I'm asking you or you're trying to get out of me, call me on it. Like I'm not trying to ask you something where the problem is you figuring out what I'm asking you. And I always say that because it's just like, if you don't know what I'm asking, I'm failing you, but also here's the opportunity to like work through what we're trying to figure out together. And that usually goes a long way to help people understand, like, oh, okay, you're actually literally just trying to understand what I'm good at. Like, let's just do it.
Sounds great in theory that we don't want to trick a candidate, but how do you then balance against a funnel of candidates coming in through technical schools and other things like that specifically prepare them for how to give you just exactly the right answer? Oh, I heard bubble sort. I remember that. I'm supposed to do this. And they don't actually understand it, but they were specifically prepared to sound like they do. So some people they do intentionally try to ask the deeper question or the trick question because they're trying to catch somebody that's just prepared for the interview and doesn't know it. So how do you balance there?
Well, I guess it's less about, I totally see what you're saying. And I think that it's, in my experience, it's really easy to tell when someone is using a buzzword and it just like, they just kind of says it and you're just like, wait, why are we using this? Or like, why is that sort of thing? It's like, I really just feel like it's really pretty easy to tell when someone is just sort of like saying these words really quickly, because especially in an interview, I'm like, oh, let's dive a little bit into this. And it's like, but why that? Or like, let's talk a little bit further. And I mean, to be honest, you as someone interviewing had better know your shit, because like, if you can't do that yourself, then like they might be able to, prevent you from really understanding that they don't get it. So that's one area. But I think, I don't know, I feel like, and maybe this is, I just have a good BS detector, but like, it is not hard for me to like ask somebody to like explain something. And that's, and to your point about like buzzwords on a resume, I love pulling some obscure buzzword from it and be like, can we talk about this technology you say you're an expert in? And then just like have them like, sort of cringe in front of you. Yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, if you don't know something, don't put it on your resume.
I mean, as an interviewer, often like what I'll do is, obviously you've written this and you've written that. I'll ask things that require more insightful answers. Like, oh, so I see that you've done Python and JavaScript. What's one thing that you wish JavaScript had that Python doesn't? Like, just like those kind of things where it's just a discussion and you can start to see, I used to do this back in the day, oh, you're using these tools. What's the number one bug you wish would be fixed, right? Or those kind of things. And to me, that suggests a little bit more insightfulness. And if they can think about it and be like come up with something, then it shows me that they have some kind of level of thoughtfulness about what they're doing, and shows it a little higher level than just having the skills to get in the door.
Yeah, one of the things that Shopify has recently added to their interview process is actually a pair programming exercise. Saying is one thing, but can you actually do what you're saying? And there's no limitations in terms of like the stack that you choose to use. Like, we give you a specific problem, and you can use any tool you want to solve it. You can open up CodePen if you want and just solve it there if you want as well. Or you can bring in this crazy like React, Redux, blah, blah, like whatever you want essentially. But we just want to see how you go about solving that problem. And because it's a pairing exercise, like I'm sitting right there next to you, you can ask me questions to clarify the problem some more. I can even help you give like, hex values or whatever, like to help you speed up the process. And what we want from the candidate is to talk out loud. And we want to we want to hear what they're thinking about as they go through finishing this exercise. We don't care whether they finish either. We just want to see what their thought process is like as they're finishing that solution.
Seems like we're dancing around and not saying one of the most hated parts, the most vaunted parts of all of tech interviewing, the whiteboard. So I want each of you to tell me, take a stand, is the whiteboard a net positive for tech interviews, or does it create a net negative effect?
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
But largely because I have a favorite question that's basically, it's super overarching. Basically, it's like, design Uber. Go. And it's like the entire point is to be like, it's like a reverse interview. The idea is like, you're supposed to ask me, what are the prior requirements? What are the things that are going to take to do this? And usually I won't just be like, here's an empty whiteboard. I'll kind of draw like a square, a cloud, and like a car, and like some arrows, and say, okay, like this is Uber. Now like explain what's inside of these things. That actually goes a long way to like get the conversation started. And it's usually like, it's really just good to get people to just like start writing. It's like writing code on a whiteboard, like absolutely not. I'm saying a whiteboard is a way to represent visually the concepts that we're talking about. And then what makes it great is that you make these connections and you can be like, let's dive into that part, or let's dive into that. Or it's like, or what happens if you like break this connection? Like, how does the system handle that? Like, I think whiteboard problems are incredibly helpful, especially when you sort of flip it around and force them to like basically figure out what the heck they're supposed to be doing. So it's like, yeah, it's not a trick, but it's very much like, and the other reason, I always preface this question with, the entire point of this exercise is to get me to show you what you do really well. And so if there's an area that you're like, I really know that the networking like stack, and I'm just gonna dive in to like, this is where HTTPS gets implemented versus this, and like that sort of thing, it's just like, I want you to show me that. Let's dive into something that's really good. And then if you do something, I'm like, let me like push your buttons over here because you totally hand waved over the database area, but like, I know you know something. Let's like extract a little bit of that.
So why do you think candidates seem to hate the whiteboard so much? Like there seems to be this predominant feeling. Maybe not every person that's ever interviewed, but there's a predominant feeling that whiteboards are very intimidating. People feel like they can't really get that's not the best way for them to get their foot forward, that sort of thing. They feel like they're without their tools. Now I'm in front of this big whiteboard. I don't have, search in front of me. I don't have autocomplete. I can't do anything. Like I'm just standing in front of this whiteboard. So what's the problem? If it does have such a good help, then why do so many candidates hate it?
Like, I can speak from personal experience. Like quite often it hasn't been as like high level. It's been like, cool, so please write this function on the whiteboard. And it's like, wait, what? This isn't what I was expecting from a whiteboarding session. You're asking me to like write out code, and I normally have like linters and other tools to make my life a whole lot easier. And I feel like at that point they're just testing whether or not I remember to put the semicolon in the right place or not. And that completely defeats the purpose of whiteboarding sessions. They end up being misused heavily, and that sort of creates like this very uncomfortable experience with whiteboarding sessions in general. Like I feel really, really awkward when someone mentions, oh, hey, there'll be a whiteboarding session. Because my brain immediately goes back to those terrible experiences I had when I had to like write actual code instead of using them as sort of like an explanation tool instead. If I get to use it as a way to express what I'm saying, if I'm not able to explain it properly and I can just draw things out better, that's fantastic. And that's what they're meant to be used for, not to actually write out code snippets.
I think a couple things with whiteboards. I'm on both ends. So this past year, I've had to do 3 technical interviews myself for my current role, and the whiteboard came up, and immediately I was like, oh shit, right? And it's that blank canvas, and I think that the number one thing about a whiteboard, at least for me personally, is about how you communicate what you know. Right? And so if you know stuff, then inherently it should just spill out of you how to communicate, and that's the kind of person I want to work with, right? And so I think whiteboard's a great tool for that. On the receiving end, I had one person do exactly that. Hey, we're gonna open up this pair programming whiteboard. You have no IntelliSense, you have no editor, you have no nothing. Tell me how to write a function like this. And I called the interviewer on it. I was like, this is not how I would write code on a day-to-day basis. Why are you doing this, right? I did it anyways. And then the second time it was similar, but it was also like, describe how you might write something that does this, and I just talked through it, right? And then I talked about the problems and why this wouldn't pass a test this way or this way. And again, I just reminded myself that it's about, for me personally, I don't know about how you guys use it, but when we're using whiteboarding, it's, okay, let's do the architecture of this or whatever. It's about how are you communicating what you know, right? Because we can always improve on what you know, and it might be good for the job, but those communication skills can sometimes take forever to develop in a person.
It's interesting that you seem to, you were kind of implying that the candidate's confidence level is an important thing, so they need to be able to express it in the best way possible. What if a candidate is really terrible at expressing things visually, but can code the shit out of a bubble sort algorithm? Are those the kind of people that we're missing out because we're trying to give them all these different mediums and some of them work for them and some of them don't?
Yeah, I mean, I was about to say depends, and then I thought, oh no, here comes a leg rustle. Again, what are you looking for? If you're looking for an engineer that's going to be doing all those things, those priorities become a priority. And if you're, small company and you need this, again, use the whiteboard for communication skills. If they are not comfortable, and I've done this before, if you're not comfortable using the whiteboard to express How in a different way would you express it? Here's my tablet, here's a pen, here's this, here's whatever you want to do, here's some Post-it notes. Just do what you need to do to express this concept. And I've done that because I know that interviewing can be intimidating, right? And some people interview really well, and they turn out to be crappy candidates, and some people don't. And so making the candidate, and you've kind of expressed this as well, making the candidate comfortable. I'm not trying to trick you or any of those things. I think is really important as an interviewer because you're going to get the best representation of what that candidate might be like in the future.
Yeah, I think it's valuable to have various kinds of interviews happen for the same candidate as well. You can't just rely on a whiteboarding session and that's like the definitive whether or not this person gets in or not. Like everyone has strengths and weaknesses. Some people, like you said, can be awesome at communicating. Some people will be completely garbage, but that doesn't mean that they're not right for your company in a specific role. So you need to have those various kinds, even if they're for a little bit, to sort of see how this person like understands various like how they're communicating, how are they actually at coding, what is their background from a technical standpoint, how are they like from a cultural standpoint. All of those things matter, some more than others, and that sort of dictates whether or not this person can fit at your company at a specific role.
So what are some of the top mistakes? Maybe just pick one each. What are some of the top mistakes that you think candidates are making in this process of going through all the different interviews? What are some of the biggest mistakes that they're making? So each of you pick a different one that you've experienced.
So I sort of mentioned this before, but I think if preparing for an interview, you spend too much time focusing on what you don't know. I know that sounds weird, but like you don't want to, you want to go in and have the confidence and go in and just say like, this is what I know, and like maybe brush up on some things, but like the reality is like the last thing you want to do is like know that like, oh, this is a word that I know kind of fits in here, and then all of a sudden you say it and then they're going to be like, let's talk about that, and then you totally go down there. Whereas if you literally say, I don't know, it's like this sounds kind of like this, right? It's like you're going to be like, honesty goes a long way when you really don't know something, because it's so easy to tell when someone doesn't and they're trying to BS their way out of it. So just don't spend too much time focusing on a bunch of stuff that you don't know, and instead focus on like really hardening the things that you do know well, and especially, and this is something that like, so oftentimes we'll do we always ask people to bring in their laptop, or if they don't, we'll provide them with one. The idea is that like be really confident in being able to bootstrap a super simple like application, like just something where it's like I'm going to ask you to write some code or make a little web app right now. Have the ability to do that in like 5 minutes, like tops, like do like an npm init plus an install this and like whatever this, and like this is my template. It's like boom, now I've got like a hello world and then it's like, okay, now what do we want to build together? As opposed like some people, like if you've got an hour or an hour and a half to write code and you spend the first 15-20 minutes getting to the point where it's like my code is now rendering, it's like, because the whole thing is like, these are your tools, you should know how to be able to do them. And that's one thing. It's like, don't focus on the things you don't know, focus on what you do know really well, so that when you're there you just nail it.
So to summarize, first off, don't try to go in and be real broad. Try to be more narrow and deep on the stuff that you're good at. And secondly, what follows from that is be honest about the stuff you know and the stuff that you don't know. Good.
Have opinions and be very, very vocal about them. That's like quite often I'll see someone be like, we use X thing at this company. How do you feel about that? Oh, I'm okay with it. Oh, I'm okay with it. I'm okay. Like, you can't be okay with everything. I know you're not. I know, like, I absolutely fucking hate Angular, and that's totally fine, and I have my own reasonings as to why I do. If you have reasonings and if you have opinions, that means you understand what it is that thing does well and that thing does poorly. If you don't have opinions, to me, that means that you don't know something well enough to be able to have those opinions yet, because you're still very, very surface level, you're still kind of exploring it. So be honest and like, tell me what sucks, tell me what doesn't. Tell me what you hate and what you don't. And that's where like some of the best conversations come from.
Good.
I mean, I can list a couple things, maybe not to do, I don't know. For me, humility goes a long way. And how you communicate what you do know, it goes a long way. I don't want to hire someone and their ego. I want to hire that person. And so there's this fine line between being overconfident, but still having the humility to say I don't know, which I think is really important. And the minute that I get that overconfident, I know everything thing, and humility, not proper attribution. You worked on a project. If you didn't do it solely, like credit the people that you work with. It goes a really long way. Like, I worked with this designer. Oh, cool. Can we talk about that? What was your workflow like? What was the pain points? Like, not accrediting for me is a huge thing. I know these seem like little nitpicky things, but I mean, I automatically write people off. The other thing is don't ever name drop. Just don't. Someone did an interview once and I was like, oh, you mean the guy who's like actually visiting New York this week and who's like staying on my couch right now? Oh, weird. You know that person? So like, don't name drop because it doesn't really get you anywhere. Like, talk about where your passion points are, right?
Okay. So the whole purpose of an interview process is to get somebody, not just that fills a seat, but somebody that stays and thrives and is a net positive for your company. So there's a whole bunch of different characteristics, and every company is probably going to have different things. I certainly know from my experience hiring, I always got different answers to that question, what makes somebody successful. But how do we figure out in the interview process, not just can you write the for loop correctly, but how do we figure out all those things, all those signals that are important, like does this, like somebody mentioned earlier about the conflict and communication and all, how do we figure those things out when the interview process, because of scaling, is necessarily really small? It's not even remotely a microcosm of what the job looks like.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the best way to get signals for that stuff is that, so depending on the interview, you'll usually go through basically like 4 or 5 different interview, like this. You come in for a day and you're gonna see like 4 or 5 different people interviewing you. And every single one of those people is gonna give you 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes to ask questions. And the questions that you ask the people interviewing you are so indicative of who you are, because you literally, it's your turn to be the interviewer, right? And like, I love it when candidates even push me on, like, when I like basically say like, well, wait, why do you do it this way? Or asking me questions about, like you want really good questions that show that they really care about their own work environment. And if they're saying like, and I really like, there's certain questions that it's like every candidate asks for, it's like this generic thing, or be like what's the work-life balance? And it's like, I mean, that's a great thing to want to know, to understand about it, but like you can ask that in so many different ways. And it's just like, I just think it's really important to say like, wait, tell me about like, what is the technology stack looking like? That is like, what is the relationship between a product manager, a designer, and an engineer at this organization? Or like, who are the ones making the decisions? Do you have 2-week sprints, or is that not even a thing? Like, ask questions that show and care about your own environment, because that's going to indicate to us, whoa, like these are the kinds of things, these are the kind of environments, aside from what text editor you want to use, like it's going to really enable you to like know like this is a person that's going to succeed in our organization.
But what about questions like, how quickly am I going to get a promotion? When do I get to be a vice president here? Is that a good question?
I mean, depending on the organization, maybe, but okay. Probably not.
Maybe a red flag. All right. Anyone else?
Yeah, I like to see like what kind of things this person is excited about beyond like the role that they'll be taking on. Are they excited about the business aspect of the company, what this company is trying to do, the impact that it's trying to make, other aspects that they want to help out in at the company? Do they want to help with the culture aspects, the diversity initiatives at the company, outreach programs? Like, there's hundreds and thousands of developers, but what makes this person more valuable to this particular company? How will they impact the company in a net positive way beyond the code that they write? And if they're interested in doing all of that stuff and putting in like all this extra time and effort into making that company even better and like understand it better, that just goes to show that they care about that role far beyond just like the code that they're writing on a day-to-day basis.
So that seems to distinguish between the mythical like 10x developer who you just put at a desk and they just churn out code, versus the more well-rounded individual that has the bigger impact. So does anybody have a different feeling on, are we always selecting for one or the other, or do we need a mixture on our teams?
I mean, I think it depends on the size of the organization, right?
Can't say it depends.
No. Well, I'm gonna say when you're a small team, well-rounded, like of course, well-rounded, right? But if you have like really large, like, it's like you're trying to optimize some incredibly specific part of the code, and it's like you want someone that's super specialized in working with, some sort of problem set, and literally it's like they're really, really good at communicating with computers, right? And like that's what you're looking for, and maybe it's like, based on their skill set, you're really not looking for someone that's well-rounded, because right now we've got a problem that's incredibly important and we want the best in the world solving this, and we might, less well-rounded. But for us in general, it's like there's some things where it's like we don't hire assholes, right? Like pretty much no matter what, you've got to be able to work on a team, and that's something that in general, like we just that's not something you can get away with.
I think that the passion thing to me is really important, because I don't care if you're that person who can churn out code like there's no tomorrow. You're obviously doing it because you're really good at it. And if you're really good at it, but you're really passionate typically. So that passion, just if I can kind of get that passion out of you somewhere, that passion is not something you can teach someone. And so, I find that, even if you can't communicate exactly what you're doing that great, but you're super passionate about it and you can kind of like, I can see that. Those are the people I try to figure out, whether you're well-rounded or a specific kind of person. That person could be good for that role because of I see this. And a lot of that passion stuff is either like a side project, to be honest, for me, because that's where you see people get really like into whatever they're doing.
Speaking of passion and side projects, one of the ways that's often seen in the interviewing process as a whole is through open source. Tell me about your GitHub projects. I want to look at your code. I want to look at all of that stuff. But there's a lot of feelings that looking at or using open source as part of the hiring process can actually reinforce various structural biases. It can it can unfairly disadvantage people who, for a variety of reasons, can't actually participate in open source, maybe because of their employer's policies or things like that. So is open source an effective tool for this process, or is it something we need to figure out how to get those signals a different way?
I think it's just one avenue that you can explore to find out what kind of work this person works on. I normally would prefer them to share what they want to share with us, and like if that's their GitHub profile, fantastic. A lot of my stuff's not on GitHub because it's normally like very closed off or in private repos, and I leave it up to the candidate. Like, what do you want to share with us? What are you stoked about? What do you want to share with us?
So let's say a candidate gives you their GitHub profile, or they've listed it on their resume or whatever. What are the things you're going to go and look for on the GitHub profile?
I want to see, what kind of, if they've mentioned that they work on X, Y, and Z, I'm going to look for examples of that. I want to see not just the fact that they're doing it, but are they doing it well? Do they, by reading some code, I can sort of understand whether or not they're, they really get the foundational concepts behind the code that they're writing. And not just, if someone says, oh, they're fantastic at CSS, but all of it is just bootstrapped everywhere, it's like, okay, cool, this is something that I'm going to want to talk to you about when you come in for an interview.
Yeah, and I think for me, because it's exactly what your point is, that a lot of people work in organizations where quite literally you're not, part of your contract is you're not allowed to open source stuff, and that's really restrictive, but at the same time you don't want to hinder those people from being able to join. So I've always thought of it like no open source is neutral, and then everything else is positive. And in the sense that it's I actually love it when people have almost none of their own personal projects and they've just got a bunch of green dots showing they've worked on a bunch of other things, or they're listing tickets, they're in there and they're doing it, and maybe they don't have they're not championing this is my library that I created, but it's I'm in there and I'm looking for stuff. I love that, and it's one of those things that and also one of my favorite things is when you look at someone's code that's this 5 years old and it's really bad, and you then see some code that's a little bit newer, you're yeah, they're learning, and then you it's one of my favorite things to be let's talk about this weird repo you have, and they're well, it wasn't very good then, and you're well, that's good. Right? Because if you hadn't changed, then everyone looks at their old code and can't believe they wrote it, right? And that's always I always think that's fun.
Yeah, there's that old adage, if you're not embarrassed by the code you release, then you waited too long. All right. Any thoughts, Stacy?
No, open source is it's a tool. We look at it, but again, if you work at a company where you can't adhere to that, then you can't adhere to it. So just be prepared to show other ways, whether it's in person or any of those kind of things.
Okay, so moving to our last discussion point as we wrap up here, just some brief thoughts from you. So the end of this interview process is either you pick a person or you don't. I want to know what you think the role is about feedback to the person. A, feedback for why you weren't selected, and B, feedback for why you were selected. What responsibility does the company have to provide that sort of feedback?
I think it's extremely, extremely valuable for the candidates to be told why they were or were not hired or brought on at the company. I actually applied to Shopify 3.5 years ago and I was rejected. And had that person not told me what those reasonings were, I wouldn't have been able to be oh yeah, cool, this is stuff I can actually tackle. This isn't it isn't some other reason that I can't fix. It was just like technical things. Oh, I can learn that. Like, I've got plenty of time. And like, I essentially was able to create a to-do list for myself to be able to like accomplish those things and then reapply years down the line. Had I not known that, like, it's very, very frustrating for the interview candidate because they have no idea where they messed up. They think like everything about them is garbage, whereas in fact it might just be like a couple of tiny things that someone like was a little bit better at them at. So it's super, super valuable. Like, I'm so glad that I was told that stuff, and I always like to make sure that I do as well.
Yeah, I totally agree. And my experience is that like usually it's like the smaller the company, the more willing they are to sort of give this candid feedback because they understand how valuable it is. And as organizations grow and get larger, they become a little bit more risk adverse to it because at some point it becomes a liability, and to the point where it's like at that point, if you're not hiring this person, you know you're not going to be getting any positive impact from this, right? It's like, so it's like, why would I like put my foot out there to like improve their next interview process? I disagree with it. It's just in my experience, that's kind of how it works out.
If it's a technical reason, I will always reach out to you personally and tell you. I always say like, we chose X because of this, or if you grew this, and this, you might be a perfect role for this, and this. If you're an asshole, forget it. I'm not going to have that conversation. Like, if it's a personality thing, I won't, personally. I mean, I probably would, but working for who I do, I shouldn't.
Yeah.
But technically, it's, if it's a technical thing and I think you can do it, then I'll let you do it, try to give you that.
Fantastic. To summarize, I think companies have a lot of responsibility to engage in the process, to make the situation the best for that candidate to shine. That includes making the decision not to bring somebody in that's not going to be a good one. When they bring them in, making sure they're drilling in. But from the candidate's perspective, I think there's an awful lot of responsibility to ask good questions, to be proactive about demonstrating the things that you're passionate about, and not overreaching, not thinking that you have to prove yourself in every single possible area, but really proving the depth that you bring to a team, the impact, as has been said several times. Thank you very much to our panelists. Give them a round of applause. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yay.